Hi everyone, today I'm going to talk a bit about deity reverence. This is something that is relevant in my own life at the moment. I'm going through a little bit of a renaissance of deity work in my own spirituality. It's something that I'm moving towards, I would say, rather than that I'm at a point where I have figured it all out for myself at this point in my spiritual journey. But it's definitely something I'm thinking about quite a lot on and off at the moment, and that's why I wanted to make a video about it for you today. Working with individual deities is one of those things that I think outsiders to the pagan community assume is monolithic within the community. They assume that it is a universal element to the whole thing, whereas there actually is a huge amount of variety in the levels to which people actually do engage with individual deities in this community and the ways in which they do so. And it's a topic that I think has just so much possibility, and there are so many different avenues and different aspects to talk about. And I'm going to try and touch on some of those today, some of the aspects that I've been thinking about in the last few months with regards to my own ever-evolving and changing spiritual practice. And of course, ever since moving back to Ireland 2 years ago, I've been in a very slow-burning spiritual renaissance. My spiritual practice has really still not fully evolved into its next phase, I don't think, and so I have been thinking a lot on and off about deities and what role they're going to play in my own practice. And I hope that this video will help you if you are also in a phase right now where you are considering and contemplating the role of individual deities in your practice, how you want that to look, and maybe you're looking for new ideas or looking for advice on how to grapple with this question. The first thing I wanted to talk about today was actually deciding how many deities you're going to work with, when to stop seeking new gods and goddesses to incorporate into your practice, when to know if 1 is enough, if 4 is enough, if 6 is too many. And I'm just going to give you a few ideas for how to approach this, because obviously there are no right and wrong answers to this. It's definitely worth mentioning early on a very simple binary system of 1 goddess and 1 god, a patron god, a matron goddess. This is possibly the most common setup in the community, probably because of the influence of Wicca, where of course we have the goddess and the god, this very dual binary system. And it's actually a pretty simple but a nice way of getting into a practice of working with individual deities. Maybe you've already been working with the goddess, maybe with the goddess and the god. And if you're looking to just move beyond working with one individual deity, or even if you're new to working with deities as a whole, maybe you do want to work with both a goddess and a god, or maybe even just 2 goddesses or 2 gods. But I think it's a nice way to sometimes signify in our lives, if we're moving away from a monotheistic religion, it's a nice way to signal that we are actually quite distinctly moving away from a habit of calling divinity by 1 name, calling god or goddess by 1 name. And when I first came back to my practice, I was quite focused on a fairly monotheistic take on divinity. I was really only interested in approaching cosmos and goddess as Gaia. And it was probably a fairly monotheistic approach and a return perhaps to my Catholic roots of understanding Godhead as being ultimately one. So if that's something that you're interested in mixing up, I definitely have found it useful at times if I'm starting to feel like that's a bit stagnant and something I want to move away from. Just even introducing a binary dual system of 2 goddesses starts to break things up. And for me personally, it was actually 2 goddesses that I started to work with more recently, about 10 years ago, that broke up that very monolithic 1 god system for 1 goddess system for me. It was when the Morrigan reasserted herself in my life that things started to get a bit more mixed up and a bit more dynamic, and that worked very well for me. So you might want a goddess and god, or 2 goddesses, 2 gods, or whatever combination, or you might not want to be thinking about gender at all, but just be thinking about individual deities. But yeah, bringing 2 into play, I think, instead of 1 can be an interesting way to mix things up if that's not something that you've worked with before. I mentioned in a recent video, I think it was my video about being a noughties teen witch, I mentioned that one of my first introductions to the concept of deities in a practice, especially specific deities in a practice, and was this idea of having 4 patron and matron deities in your life who would represent the four elements and the four quarters, and that potentially even would be called at the four quarters, or at least I think that's one of the ideas. That's one of the ways that I worked with that concept at the time as a teenager. And this is something that I have found to be a really useful structure in my own practice in terms of setting limits and setting boundaries, because there are so many different gods and goddesses that I could attempt to take the time to work with, to develop a relationship with, to learn more about. But I find if I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed with that, it is actually useful to set those parameters. Sometimes that changes over time for me. But having that limit of 4 at any one time can be useful. So I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail, and I know I have talked about this before on the channel about my separating my altar into 4 seasonal altars and focusing on 4 different deities during those times, but I haven't made a specific video about deities where I talk about this concept, and that this might be a more useful way for you to take on that information if you're not wanting to wade through videos on altars. The idea of working with 4 patron or matron gods was introduced to me primarily, as I say, with this association of the 4 quarters and the 4 elements. And I did play around a little bit with invoking them at the 4 quarters, but that wasn't the initial practice that was posited to me. It was more this idea that because there are 4 quarters in the sacred circle or the magic circle, that it made sense for there to be 4 primary deities in your life that would represent those elements, and through whom I suppose you could work more closely with those elements. I found this fun at the time. I found a lot of satisfaction in trying to decide what kinds of deities, what kinds of gods and goddesses I would feel would represent those 4 elements, and thinking about it made me think more about the elements. I mean, the elements aren't something I work, the 4 classical elements aren't something I work with anymore, but at the time it was an interesting way to play with new concepts. And it did, you know, I was looking at the question of which might be considered feminine, which might be considered masculine, which again is something that I'm not really into anymore, but it was an interesting process for me at the time. And I actually genuinely can't even remember exactly which 4 deities I worked with at that time. All I know is that the Morrigan was one of them. That concept really stuck with me over time. I think the number 4 is a really stable number as well. I actually talked to a client about this fairly recently too. It's a very stable number in the tarot as well, almost to the point sometimes of inertia, but I think it's a very strong number of foundations and laying roots, and there's a reason that it's so prevalent in ceremonial magic, I think. It feels very grounded, and of course it's grounded very much in the Wheel of the Year. It's grounded very much in the 4 seasons. We have 8 Sabbaths as well, so you might want to split them into 2 per deity. There are a lot of very nice associations that we can draw between 4 deities and all of the other elements from ceremonial magic that have made their way into the general pagan Wiccan milieu. So as I mentioned, and as you might have heard me talking about before, when I came back to this concept of 4 deities in my own practice, 2 goddesses and 2 gods, I specifically wanted to associate them with the 4 seasons more than any 4 elements. Actually, currently in my own practice, and for quite a long time now, I've been working with 3 elements rather than 4, which is a more Irish/Celtic, I think an Irish understanding of land, sea and sky, with a little bit of the sun thrown in there as well, but I primarily work with them as a stand-in for elements. So associating them with the elements doesn't really work for me anymore, but I really did want to have different deities for each season because I was missing a sense of really shifting into a different mindset and a different way of practicing at different times of the year. I think after a while the Sabbaths become a bit rote. So far that hasn't actually ended up being a huge part of my practice, and turning towards each deity in each season hasn't felt organic. I've actually just felt more drawn to working with each one at different times, and I still find that I work with some more than others. So I would counsel you as well that if you have an idea in your head of the perfect practice that involves a set amount of deities that you're going to work with at certain times, but you're finding that that's not really working out for you, it's not coming out in the wash, it's not just fitting in with your schedule, I wouldn't worry about that at all. So my 4 deities, as I've mentioned before on the channel, that I work with in this capacity are the Morrigan and Gaia, who have been long-standing figures, Odin, who has been hovering around in the sidelines for a long time as well, and Cernunnos, who again has been a fixture in my practice. I don't always use the term Cernunnos, but the horned god, that general concept has been around for me for a long time, and that to me is really just the egregore of the god, the Wiccan god that I encountered early on in my spirituality. So again, he's actually been around with me from the very beginning as well, and I feel that those four figures have really just been in my life for an extremely long time, much more now than half of my life. We're talking nearly 20 years. So all of them are very familiar figures, but at the same time, many of them, and in fact probably all of them, have facets that I really haven't explored yet, and that I am still really excited to think about. And I am actually still in a phase now, despite having been walking alongside these deities for, like I say, pretty much almost 20 years. I still actually haven't fully grasped what they mean to me and why it is that there are four of them. So I said that I wanted to associate with them with the seasons, and that is potentially something that you might want to do, and that might work very well for you. I was very excited about this idea at the time, and you might want to try that and maybe it would work. Like I say, I found that balance didn't quite work. It wasn't quite right for me, and I've realized for myself that what I need to do is to figure out, I have this intuition that there is some segment, some separation into four components in my own worldview that feel like they need to be acknowledged. So for a long time, I worked with a binary system of creation and destruction as representative of this cycle of creativity that we witness in cosmos, on the earth, in the universe. That's been something that I have wanted to represent in my spirituality for a very long time, and that binary system of creation, destruction, and that relationship between the two, causing change and causing creativity, has been something for a very long time that has been very close to my heart. But I think it started to feel a little bit stagnant for me, and now I'm trying to look at that and think, how is it that I might either break that into further components, or actually perhaps just introduce new concepts altogether that I feel are perhaps missing from that very simplistic binary system. And I think that once I get to the other end of that question, I'm going to have found the answer to why it is that I have felt for maybe 3 or 4 years that I really need to make more space in my practice for these four individual deities. So I'm just giving you that specific information on my own practice, my own journey, and my own figuring of things out, because maybe you're finding something similar. You might feel that you have been drawn to a particular number of deities, and I mean, you don't have to have a big reason for why you've been drawn to a specific number or specific deities, but it might be useful for you in figuring out what you do with those deities, how they work in your practice, how they present themselves, how you interact with them. It might be useful to think about things like that and to try and figure out, well, what is it about your worldview, your understanding of yourself as a spiritual being and the world as a spiritual place, that has maybe manifested that number or those specific deities into your spiritual life. So those are just a few examples. You might have other numbers in mind that make sense to you, that are meaningful for you and your own particular spiritual path, that you feel is the right number of deities for you. Or you might just want to leave it open-ended, that you can invite as many deities into your life at any one time that feels right, and that might change month by month, year by year. But as I said in the beginning, if you are feeling a bit overwhelmed and trying to decide which deities to work with and which not, sometimes having a number in mind it can be really helpful, because it can help you draw a line in the sand, because I think many of us will feel that we have, like the people in our lives, that we have this ever-expanding circle, like the center of a tree, let's say, or a spiral, that we have ones in the middle very close to us that we feel like we definitely want to work with those, but then you go out in this ever-expanding spiral and there are more and more and more deities that are interesting or that you feel drawn to, that enter into your life briefly at different times, and you're thinking, should I be trying to work with these? How much should they be involved in my practice? And sometimes having that idea of a number can actually be helpful, having a structure, because it does help you draw a line in the sand and say, well, at least for this period of time, I'm going to work with this number, and then if these deities still feel like they're knocking on my door, I can come back to them at a later date. Another element I wanted to touch on in this video, but I think that perhaps I'll make a whole separate video on this topic because it's quite a big topic, but I wanted to at least mention it in this video today, was the question of what you actually do with deities and how you work with them, what it means to work with them, to worship them, to venerate them, and so on. And what on earth that actually might look like in a practice, because I think sometimes people are a little bit lost because there's a variety. Some people talk in quite a lot of detail about what their practice looks like with deities. Some people are actually quite private about it and don't really open up that much about what that looks like in their day-to-day lives. I just want to talk about this in a very general sense. Like I say, I think I might make a more detailed video talking in a lot more specifics about the different practices that you actually can try in terms of deity worship or deity veneration. In this video, I'm just going to hit on 3 different concepts. So 3 different ways that you might think about your relationship to deities. And that is the idea of working with a deity, the idea of venerating or revering a deity, and the idea of worshipping a deity, although I suppose revering might fall more into the worship category. So we'll just say working with, venerating, and worshipping. This is kind of nitpicky in a way, maybe, to separate these into 3 different categories, but I think it's a good way of brainstorming your own understanding of what deity is and what it means for you to relate to them. So first of all, when we say working with deity, I think we use this a lot as a catch-all term, and I don't think people usually mean this in a very specific way of asking deities to intervene in our lives and giving them offerings or giving them our time and our energy in order to get them to offer us something back in return, at this exchange type of understanding of the relationship. But I think that those people who do understand it as an exchange of energy often do describe it in terms of working with. And there's nothing wrong with this concept, there's nothing wrong with this understanding, and I think it might sound a bit mercenary, and this is perhaps a model of deity reverence or deity relationship that maybe magical practitioners might work with, some people who primarily work magic in their practice, and that maybe their practice isn't particularly focused on divinity. They might actually invoke deities at certain times to ask them for help with a particular matter. But I also think that it's not necessarily very mercenary or very practical in nature. Also, sometimes we can have very emotional, deep-rooted emotional, psychological issues that we're working through, that we might feel a particular deity is going to be able to help us with their own specific energy, with their own associations, that is something that maybe we want to invite into our lives. So I think this relationship with deity of working with, there's no concept of necessarily a long-term relationship, which can actually be helpful. There's also no sense in which you necessarily need to be viewing this deity as being the ultimate representation of divinity, or even a representation of something that you find to be particularly sacred or particularly worthy of veneration. I think if you're working with a deity, sometimes you might be working through your shadow, and there might be a deity that you want to invite in to try and work with that complicated part of yourself, and that doesn't necessarily mean that that deity is something that has qualities that you are uplifting and I suppose, like I say, venerating in your life as something that you want to be emulating as a whole. So I think working with is a very broad catch-all term. Let me move on to the difference between veneration and worship, which I think is an interesting, nuanced difference that is worth mentioning, because I don't think we often make this distinction in the community, but I think it is worth thinking about sometimes. So this is a distinction that's actually made within Christianity, or specifically Catholicism, where veneration of the saints is posited against worship of God. So worship is reserved for true divinity, divine figures, God, and so on. Veneration is of persons, non-divine persons or spirits, like saints, like the Virgin Mary, who are considered to have qualities and qualities that are worthy of respect and love, perhaps, and that they might be able to help the individual, but that they are not in themselves divine. Thinking about deities in this way can be, I find, a useful way of extracting myself from a mentality that my set of individual deities has to somehow combine to create this overarching whole of divinity, that each of them have to contain, at least when they're all combined together, every single element of the universe and everything that is sacred and wonderful about the world. And I think that's a lot of pressure I think having a system like that can be very exciting and wonderful if you feel that your set of deities, that they do combine together to create this symbolic picture of a divine whole. That's wonderful if that works, but if it doesn't, I think thinking more in terms of veneration than worship can be useful if you just feel like, well, this deity just has this one quality or this one aspect to them that I want to venerate, that I want to respect, that I want to invite into my life a little bit more. Veneration doesn't necessarily suggest working with. So working with, like I say, might suggest a mercenary interaction where you are offering something to the deity in exchange for help in return. But also it might suggest working with, as in you are working on yourself with the help of this deity. Work is involved, right? When you're working with a deity, there is work, there is a goal, there is an outcome. Venerating can be done just purely for the sake of veneration. You might just want to meditate on a particular quality or a particular symbolic aspect of this deity that is meaningful to you, that is evocative to you, that brings you joy or peace or some positive thing into your life. And then finally we have worship, and I think considering your relationship with deity as a worship, as a worshipful encounter has a lot of weight, it has a lot of meaning behind it. And this is maybe this is something that you want to reserve in your own mind for those deities with whom you really have developed a powerful relationship. Now, I'm not here to say that you can't consider yourself to be worshipping deities that you don't have a long-standing relationship with, that you don't have that deep and long-standing bond. But I do think that thinking about whether or not you actually are in a worshipping relationship with a deity versus a venerating one could be helpful, because as I kind of implied before, to my mind, worship is you really are elevating that deity to perhaps a higher level in your mind of being representative in some way of divinity perhaps as a whole, or something that is especially awe-inspiring to you and especially representative of whatever it is that makes you feel that the universe is divine. So there's a lot in there, and it really does imply perhaps more dedicated relationship with a deity than pure veneration. Veneration is something that you can kind of come in and out of, and perhaps you might have a deity that you only connect with once per year on a particular day, and that's a day when you venerate this particular deity or figure. Worship, to my mind, is more evocative of an ongoing relationship, something that you come back to again and again, and something that you build upon over time. And to my mind, I would consider myself only worshipping deities whom I do consider to be symbolic of some of those big concepts, those big symbolic concepts in my own mind, through which I try to wrap my head around the entirety of cosmos and the entirety of the divine cosmos, more particularly. So all of that is stuff that I think I will get more into in another video. Like I said, I think I will make another video at some point about specific details of all of these different ideas actually of working with, venerating and worshipping deity. I might give examples of each in a future video, but do let me know if you think that would be helpful in the comments below. Let me know any thoughts and questions. Any questions that come up, I do generally try to answer them in future videos. Sometimes I make an entire video even on that topic, so do leave those in the comments down below. Thanks for watching this video. I hope you're all doing well. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already, if you enjoyed this video, and yeah, I'll be talking to you again soon.